Hi, I'm Angus Kress Gillespie, your host for Old Ways in New Jersey. I'm here with Michael Gabriele, author of the brand new book, New Jersey Folk Revival Music, published by the History Press. A lifelong Garden State resident, Michael has worked as a journalist and freelance writer for more than 40 years. But today, we want to focus on his new book. In this book, Michael Gabriele traces the evolution and living history of the folk music revival in New Jersey and how it has changed the lives of people on stage and in the audience. I'm pleased that Michael Gabriele is able to join us here in East Brunswick today. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And my first question is the obvious one. Why did you write this book?
I wrote this book, well, I got an invitation to write it because this is actually my third book for the History Press. I'm very, very happy to be working with my publisher. They're very nice to me. I'm a journalist by trade.
Yes.
So I'm always looking for a story.
Sure.
And I'm looking for a story to tell, and I'm looking for the untold story to write about. It's a little bit like being a reporter and you want to get the scoop and you want to get it first and you want to get it right. So as I was doing my due diligence and my research, I kept coming back to this idea of folk music. I know a little bit about folk music, enough that I could get started on it.
Yeah.
And the more I looked at it and the more I did research and the more little things I was finding out, I just kept saying, yeah, there's something here. There's a story to be told here. I was aware of the folk festival. There's a group in the Morristown area called the Folk Project.
That's right. Yeah.
There's a big bluegrass festival down in Salem County. So I thought there was an audience there.
Yeah.
So there's a story audience.
Sure, because you don't want to write a book for which there's no buyers.
No.
Yeah.
A bell's not a bell unless you ring it, or what? How's that song go? So when I make my pitch to my publisher, it's like, okay, here's my idea for a book. Okay, and who's going to buy it? Well, I mean, I think there's people that will be buying it. So okay, they said yes. I said, all right. I signed my contract, got my deadline, and then I go. Now I'm jumping into it, and I hope it turns out. And I'm very proud. It turned out even better than I thought. I'm very proud of the finished product. Yeah.
Well, I think you have a right to be.
Yeah.
But a follow-up question is, how did you go about gathering your information?
When you're a journalist, we say you always follow your sources. So I started out with a couple of conversations with some pretty knowledgeable people, you included, some other people, Jim Albertson down in southern New Jersey, some other people that I knew, some organizations, and that's what I did. One thing leads to another. You interview somebody, you talk to somebody, it's like, oh, and did you talk to this person? No, I don't know who that is. Do you have his phone number? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And I did a lot of research in libraries. I did a lot of research online. I looked at a lot of books. In the beginning, you're just gathering. You're just gathering information and just stockpiling it. And then you reach a point where you say, I think I got it. It's like a critical mass. You say, you keep asking yourself questions along the way. Okay, so now, if this person did this, how did it work in with, and I'm very particular about dates, places, and I try to be very, it's not just facts and information, it's the story. It's the narrative. I'm trying to tell a story. I'm trying to connect point A to point B to point C. That's the thing. And then at some point when you gather all these information, you say, yeah, here it is. Now I can write it. And you start writing it. And then you're editing and updating along the way, and that's the process. First draft, second draft, third draft.
You were connecting the dots.
Connecting the dots, yeah, that's the best way to say it. Yeah, connecting the dots.
For the purpose of our audience, what's the difference between folk revival music and traditional folk music?
Yes.
Because that's in your title.
It is in my title. This came up a number of times. I had a lot of suggestions about what the title actually should be. I respect for folklorists and people who are in academic circles, traditional folk music is really almost like a cultural anthropology thing, right?
Yeah.
It's another way to identify a certain people or ethnic group or region, clothing, food, architecture, the music they have, the traditional tunes that have been handed down orally over the years, and it's been forgotten whoever the original author was, even if there was an original author, but people have been singing these songs. And there's different ways the tunes, sometimes they have a utilitarian purpose. There'd be tunes that the weavers would sing when they're doing there would be songs that the sailors would sing, sea shanties on the tall ships, that kind of stuff. So, okay, traditional folk music, that's the music that kind of comes down from the hills, it's been handed down over the generations. Folk revival or folk renaissance maybe is even a better way to say it.
Yeah.
Think of Florence in the 1500s. You had all these amazing artists come together at one point, one time, and they had a great appreciation for the classics, what went before, the Roman architecture, the Roman artwork, Greek, and they used that as their inspiration, and then they went off and created their own things. They used that as a starting point. So in the early 1900s, there was an awareness of these tunes, and there was a very special guy named Cecil Sharp who came to the United States, went down to Appalachia, found tunes that were sung, and he could trace them back ancient days to Scotland, Ireland, England. And he wrote a book, and he then took the songs that he identified, transposed them, and he had them recorded at the recording studios in Camden, New Jersey, the Victor Studios. And that was really, I think, the idea of a revival, because he went back, found these original songs, these traditional folk tunes, and people were inspired. And that kind of set the stage. That really was like a format that people could use and then start writing their own songs. So he was very important. So it's the idea that it's songs they're built on time-honored traditions, but you invent your own songs. And then, of course, maybe the next revival was Woody Guthrie, who also recorded in Camden, New Jersey. The Greenwich Village scene in the late 50s, early 60s, I think that was another revival. People, again, building upon what came before them. And I think we're even in a revival now. So it's new songs that take all sorts of mix and match other elements, but build upon their traditions. So that's the revival or the Renaissance.
Yeah. Well, a follow-up to that, in New Jersey, we did have a distinguished academic, Herbert Halpert. He came through the Pine Barrens back in the 30s.
Yes.
And he was collecting the old traditional songs and stories, one of which sticks in my mind. It's the story of Sammy Giberson.
Sammy Giberson.
Yeah.
Now, talk about an untold story. There's a guy who I think he could be a hero to anybody today who plays a guitar or a banjo or a fiddle. Yeah. He was a legendary figure, but he was a real figure. I used Halpert's notes, his unpublished paper, which is in the library in Rutgers. I found some other sources too. In the mid-1800s, Sammy Giberson would be walking through the Pine Barrens with his fiddle and a little sack, and just by word of mouth, he was invited to play at all these dances and taverns and festivals and parties. And there's a guy, I'm sure he had a lot of standard tunes that he would play because he knew them, traditional songs. But I mean, think about it. Just like any good musician, if you have the ear, I'm sure he would improvise sometimes. And maybe he even made up a couple of his own songs or took a song and kind of did his own little thing with it. Or maybe played it in a different key or something. So there's a guy who's, I think he's a hero. Yeah. He's a hero. Yeah, Sammy Giberson.
Very interesting story.
Yeah.
Moving on into the 20th century, perhaps the best known folk revival singer in America was Pete Seeger.
Yes.
And late in life, he was most associated with kind of upstate New York and purifying, cleaning up the Hudson River.
Yes.
Having said that, he also had extensive New Jersey connections. Maybe you can touch on that.
He did. He's a good example of connecting the dots to point A, point B. He became a fairly prominent musician in the 40s. Of course, he had an association with Woody Guthrie.
Sure.
A lot of people know that he was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee. The reason he was called, or the pretext for that, he had performed, I found this out through my research, he performed at an event in Newark in 1948, I think. It was sponsored by the Essex County Communist Party. And he performed there. It was a hall in Newark. It's still there, I suppose. And so they brought him in and they said, well, Mr. Seeger, you performed. And of course, he wouldn't admit to anything. And he kept saying, basically, he told, look, this is my business. It's none of your business. Okay, so he's famous for that. He
sort of stonewalled.
Right. He stood up he spoke truth to power.
Yeah.
And of course, he got blacklisted for that, as did a lot of other people
Yeah.
back in that era. All right, so he's blacklisted. He's still performing, though, and still recording once in a while, but never on TV, not on the radio. He's, banned. He performs in New Jersey. There was a thing down in Lambertville called the Music Circus. He performed there, and that inspired a lot of people. And when he performed there in the early 60s, he was performing music that people hadn't heard before. Bob Dylan, Tom Paxson. Some of the songs were a little political. And that, again, kindled this idea of a revival. On ABC, there was a program that they developed, launched. It was pretty innovative at the time. It was called Hootenanny. And they would take their cameras and go to a college and tape these live sessions. And all these people were these emerging musicians at the time. The only musician who didn't get invited was Pete Seeger. So he's thinking, okay, I'm not on network television. What am I? TV is a powerful medium now. He's grasping. So he decides he's going to go to what they called at the time UHF. This is before cable TV. There was a UHF station in Newark. He produces a show called Rainbow Quest, and you can still find episodes of this online, and you can actually buy some of the tapes exist. This is like mid-1960s, 65, 66. He produced all these shows at the old Mosque Theater in Newark, which is now a Symphony Hall. And again, think about it. He was inviting people like Johnny Cash and all these famous musicians. They were showing up in Newark and they performing live on his show, and these were all taped. And so that's part of his legacy. And then, of course, he went on. He performed a number of times at colleges. He played at Drew University 3 times in the 1970s. So yeah, there's a very close association with him in New Jersey. And again, maybe people, they know a little bit about it, or maybe heard about it, or maybe they never heard about it. But these are the stories that I tried to
track down. And
when you put them all together, now you got there's your narrative. There's your narrative.
So building on what you just said, the 1960s and 1970s pretty much recognized it's the folk music revival throughout the United States.
Yes.
And we just talked about Pete Seeger, but what are some of the other manifestations of the folk revival in New Jersey?
Well, Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, they were the hot stars,
Sure.
especially when they appeared at the Newport Folk Festival.
Of course.
They had early performances here in New Jersey, back when their careers were first getting started.
What's on the cover of your book?
What's on the cover of the book, that's a performance. Joan Baez was the headliner at the Camden Music Festival in 1963.
Wow.
That was in August of 1963.
It's a long time ago, and she was very young.
Very young. Well, we were all very young back then. 2 weeks later, again, Joan was the headliner. She brought Bob along. They performed at the Convention Hall in Asbury Park. August 1963. Okay, August 1963. What happened at the very end of August? March on Washington. They perform at the steps of Lincoln Memorial. So New Jersey was the warm-up act.
Sure.
Yeah.
I want to move on to the singer-songwriter Woody Guthrie. Now, historically, he's usually associated with the state of Oklahoma, but he does have New Jersey connections. Can you tell us about that?
Got a real important New Jersey connection. Okay, he took a bus and then hitchhiked part of the way, arrived in New York City in the winter of 1940, performed at a very important event at a theater in New York, which was designed to raise money for migrant farm workers. It was named after the famous book, The Grapes of Wrath. It was called The Grapes of Wrath event. Woody was a brand new face, and he got a lot of press in New York City. And because of that, he became recognized as a leading American balladeer.
Yeah.
They're called ballad. Wasn't a folk singer, a balladeer, because he was writing his own songs.
Sure.
And there were other people like him floating around the country, but he just was in the right place at the right time. So he performed at this concert. Because of that concert, he made connections and got an offer. They wanted to do a folk album at the RCA studios in Camden, New Jersey. So, okay, I'm picturing, well, there's Woody Guthrie, gets on a train, he's got guitar in one hand, he's got his notebook in the other hand, takes the train down to Camden, shows up at the recording studio in May of 1940, and I think there was even a subsequent session after that, and performs his Dust Bowl ballads. So
wow.
that's considered that's a milestone in this whole progression of music. Where did he perform it? Not in Oklahoma, not Texas, not New York City, Camden, New Jersey.
Wow.
So and I think these are things that are important. History is all about place. You know, it happened here in New Jersey. I think that's important.
Speaking of history, if we go way, way, way back, the original New Jersey musicians were probably the Lenni Lenape Indians.
Absolutely.
So what did you learn about them?
When I was doing my research, I was very honored and very fortunate. I got an invitation to go all the way down to Bridgeton, which is where they have their land there. And I met the chief. It was actually, they invited me to come on a day when they had this little festival out in the fields there, and it was an educational program for children. And I talked to them, there's a picture in the book. So I think about, again, the definition of traditional folk music.
Sure.
Handed down over the generations, orally transmitted, has a utilitarian purpose. Well, all their dances with drumming and playing for festivals and religious occasions and fun occasions. So they were located here in New Jersey. We're going back thousands and thousands of years now.
Sure.
So you want to talk about traditional folk, there's an example.
Well, let's jump ahead to 1941.
1941, okay.
Can you tell us about the research of Dorothea Dix Lawrence?
I came upon that story. It was a very interesting story. She was a prominent folklorist in New Jersey at the time. I believe she came from Plainfield. And she was associated with the National Folk Festival in Washington, D.C., which again is a pretty big deal. Was back then, and I guess still is now. And again, they're looking for regional musicians that tell a story about a particular place or particular ethnic group. So as the story was told to me, she was riding around the Pine Barrens, and she was looking for musicians from that area. She knew that there was a lot of stuff going on down there, but she was basically approaching it fresh. And she pulled into a post office in Waretown, and she was saying, I'm looking for musicians. And so this is how the story's told. The postmaster said, you got to go see the Bamber Boys. The Bamber Boys, who are they? So she goes to Bamber, and she finds the Bamber Boys. 3 guys who eventually became known as the Pine Hawkers. And they did perform in the 1941 National Folk Festival. And that was a big deal at the time. And they represented...
One was Merce Ridgway Sr.
Merce Ridgway Sr., who was fairly prominent. And these guys, they showed what the music was like in the Pine Barrens back then. And they performed, and they got a lot of good press out of it. And again, those are the type of things. Do the old, 6 degrees of separation? Think about all the people that they inspired, who went on to inspire other people and other people. So,
And the Pine Hawkers are pretty much like, by definition, they were folk musicians. They were rural, they were isolated, they performed informally for family, home, and community.
Yes, and little festivals. The 2 songs, I found an article in the Asbury Park Press way back then. They performed 2 songs, at least that's what was reported. One was supposed to be a song that they said was handed down from the pirate days. Smuggling was a big deal in the Pine Barrens back then. And it was a respectable occupation. So they performed what they said was a traditional song, a pirate song. The other song they performed was the Mount Holly Jail, which people have told me, like you, that's our oldest New Jersey folk song.
Yeah.
Hard times in the Mount Holly jail. So.
There are precedents for that in the British Isles.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
All you have to do is change the venue.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, moving ahead, Bob Dylan, he was originally from Minnesota, but he has lots of New Jersey connections. You've mentioned some of them already.
Yes. He got a doctorate from Princeton in 1970, which apparently he was a little nervous about or didn't like that kind of thing, but he showed up and got the award. That was very nice. He performed at Princeton in 1963, a solo concert. Did a couple of solo concerts in Newark at the old Mosque Theater, today Symphony Hall, and this is when he was getting his notoriety. He was acclaimed as a leading voice in the new folk music folk revival music that was being performed. Yeah, performed at Rutgers University. I think that was a solo concert in 1965. Again, he's becoming Bob Dylan, and he's got venues here in New Jersey. And again, think about all the people that went to hear him. Think about all the people that got inspired. Think about the people who said, yeah, I really like this music. I'm going to go buy a guitar. I'm going to buy a banjo. I'm going to see if I can. Yeah. That's how it happens.
Yeah. I think arguably the first modern day folk festival in New Jersey was the Middletown Folk Festival. It was organized by Dick and Marlene Levine.
Nice people.
Can you tell us a little bit of how that got started?
People. They were lovers of the music. They used to go on their own. Used to go to there was a folk festival in Foxwood, New York, and they went to the Newport Festival. And they were just inspired, and they performed music themselves. And they used to have this little community down there in Middletown, and they would invite people. And then every couple of weeks or so, people would come to the house and have these little house parties or house jams or folk sings. And the idea occurred to them. They said, "Gee, I think there's an audience here. People seem to be interested in this. Let's sponsor a little festival." So they established themselves as a nonprofit organization, got permission from all the localities and all the governmental people, had a festival at a park down in Middletown, and it was very successful. And so that was, I think, a precursor to a lot of things that went on later. And it went on for about 15, 20 years or so, I forget. And so I guess after that came the New Jersey Folk Festival, which you are the grand poobah, the founder. Yeah. You told me you were a little worried because it was raining all that week.
That's right.
But then the clouds parted, the sun came out, and you had your festival. And a lot of people turned out.
Yeah.
We started big and we stayed big.
Yes.
That's my quote from the chapter.
One of our very first MCs was Jim Albertson, and you did interview him. Tell us a little bit about Jim Albertson.
In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I went down to Millville. There's a bookstore down there that's selling lots of books. He's a real character. He's a real good guy, and real important in terms of our New Jersey culture. So, I think he was at the very first one. And he's a musician. He's a folklorist. He's a teacher. He's a radio disc jockey. He's very active today, and he does it all. Yeah, good guy, and a good friend. He was really helpful, like you, in helping me get going with this, and that's why I dedicated the book to you and to him.
Thank you.
In the grand scheme of things, in the big universe, who are the two guys? I said, they're the two guys. I'm going to dedicate the book to them. So
I appreciate it.
Yes.
Well, a bit of a follow-up about the New Jersey Folk Festival is from the get-go, we decided not just to do music, but to also do craft demonstrations. And one of our early craft demonstrators was David Field. Can you tell us about him?
Jim Albertson, in one of my conversations, mentioned, we were talking about instruments and different kind of things. We were talking about the dulcimer, and he said, "Oh, by the way, there's this guy in New Jersey. He's the Stradivarius of dulcimer." And I said, "Oh, really? Well, who is he? Where is he? How do I get in touch with him?" Turned out I did get I was on one of my little road trips. Yeah, David Fields, and he lived in Collingwood at the time, which is down
South Jersey.
Yeah, South Jersey. I was on one of my little excursions gathering information, and I talked to him on the phone a couple times, and called him. I said, "Look, I'm coming down to your neck of the woods. Can I come visit you at your house?" He said, "Yeah, sure." I came in, we talked. He wasn't feeling too well at the time, but he took me downstairs, showed me his workshop, and we were talking. He's made dulcimers over the years for some real important people, like Gene Ritchie and people like that.
Wow.
And he's a real hero for our folk revival culture here in New Jersey. Maybe a lot of people don't know about him, but people who do know about him appreciate what he's done over the years. And yeah, he was a genius. He taught himself how to build instruments, and he told me he built a number of hundreds of dulcimers. He even built a few harps and one guitar, he said. I don't know who. Somebody must have that. That's a collector's item. I don't know who, but
it's a collector's item, yeah.
Somebody's got it. So yeah, he was an important guy.
Recently, Barry Mitterhoff received the New Jersey Folk Festival Lifetime Achievement Award, and he's kind of an important figure. Can you tell us about him?
I heard about him. I like hot tuna, so I kind of knew his credit there. I heard of him and I read a little bit about him, but I didn't have any way to get in touch with him. Well, who knows this guy? So when I was looking online about New Jersey Folk Festival last 2016, right?
Yeah.
Barry Mitterhoff's going to get the Lifetime Achievement. I said, well, okay, now I got him. Now I know where to find him. So I made sure I came down that day and called some of the people, the organizers, and said, look, I got to talk to this guy. And he was very nice, real charming guy, and told his little story about how his Aunt Sylvia bought him a mandolin when he was a teenager, and all these people that he performed with. And he was a world-class musician. And he was born at a hospital in Newark, grew up in Irvington. So a Jersey guy.
Yeah.
A Jersey guy. Nice guy.
Perhaps one more Jersey guy is a transplant from West Virginia. You know, the New Jersey Folk Festival, from time to time, we featured black gospel music, and perhaps the most distinguished black gospel musician in New Jersey is Marion Hanna. Can you tell us just a little bit about him?
I met him a couple of years ago
at the festival.
At the festival, he was standing with you. I took your picture.
Yeah.
And he just seemed like a nice guy, very interesting. And you went off. You had some other things to do, and I was just chatting with him, and he started telling me this story about how. And he was telling me these things. I was writing them down, and then later I went home and I Googled some of the things. Yeah, there he is, and there's actually recordings of him. And he's a pastor of a church down in New Brunswick,
Antioch Christian Church. Yeah.
And he told me the story about how he was performing at the Apollo Theater in the late '50s, and Nat King Cole took him aside and said, my friend, you're the best gospel singer I've ever heard. Yeah, so, and again, an important guy. The gospel tradition, yeah, that's, traditional folk, sure, why not?
I'm just very touched to have such a long-standing relationship with him because he's a very distinguished gospel singer.
It was just by chance. I had my camera, came upon, there you were, and oh, there, let me get your picture. Michael, this is, oh, nice to meet you. Had no idea who he was, but that's how these things happen. Right place, right time.
And what would you tell our audience would be the takeaway from your book? What conclusion would you come up with?
I hope it's a good read, and I hope for people who maybe don't know that much about New Jersey folk and folk revival music, it'll be a little educational. They'll be charmed by it. They'll say, "Oh, gee, I never knew that it was Bob Dylan was here. I never knew Woody Guthrie recorded his first album here." Things like that. People, I like that they're surprised by it. That they take into account that this is an important thing. And New Jersey, again, place is very important.
Sure.
These things happen. For people who maybe are a little more immersed in this musical genre, again, I hope that people come away with maybe a little deeper understanding, because I've tried to give a fairly comprehensive sweep about all this.
Well, thank you for coming here to East Brunswick to our studio and sharing your knowledge with us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.